I go back and forth about wanting to really take people's subjective experiences into consideration, and then also on the other side of, what's science kind of telling us, or what is the research telling us, and the research pointing to that there's not too much going on. There's a study that came out of University of Chicago or somewhere in Chicago that kind of validated that, it's not a placebo by saying that small doses of LSD can have certain effects on the body, which I think some of it was like increased pupil size and stuff like that. But that's not saying anything about increasing creativity. It's just saying that a small dose of a substance is having some sort of effect on your body.
That was kind of a good segue in terms of using psychedelics for fitness, because I've been microdosing for over a year and a half now, and I've run anywhere from a marathon to 100-mile, the Leadville 100, using psychedelics, using LSD, anywhere from, say, 10 to 20 micrograms up to, in race settings, up to about 80 micrograms, and then probably up to maybe 100 and 120, and just in training situations, just to kind of see where the performance enhancement stops, and then where it starts to get a little dicey, and you might need to just lay on the side of the trail and kind of melt into the ground.
Yeah. Right.
And so, 75 to 80 is definitely very manageable in a road race situation. Where in a trail situation where you're going up and down mountains and the footing can be unstable with rocks and roots and stuff, I think, although 100 is pretty fun when you're in just you're out with your friends and you're doing it, in a race situation, I think it needs to be a much more closer to like a microdose, or maybe like an incremental feedings of it throughout the day, depending on the duration. But I've had a lot of success and can definitely attest to the fact that it can be a performance enhancing benefit. And I was speaking with someone from Runner's World, I believe, or Competitor Magazine, one of the two. And what is the definition of performance enhancement? Because I think a lot of times people associate performance enhancement with steroids or testosterone, and it's giving you the ability to recover and to train harder and to get back out there more. And my thought what I presented to her was, well, if I'm in this state and I appreciate the clouds more, or I feel like I can see the trees dancing and it's not windy, and all of a sudden I have a greater gratitude for what I'm doing and an appreciation for what I'm doing, or the fact that I have the ability to qualify for the Boston Marathon and run with 30,000 other people, and that changes my mood. Isn't that performance enhancement? So
right.
That's
yeah, this is the conversation we were having as well that night at that event, right? Yeah, that's interesting. What do you find from that experience? I guess you were describing it, but like, what type of benefits do you find from microdosing or taking a dose before running? Like, do you feel like more stamina? That appreciation, or is it kind of like that flow state to be able to disconnect from your normal mind, kind of drop into your body and just access a different state of consciousness that might help you focus on running a little bit more?
No, you can definitely get into those flow-like states very quickly. It allows me to focus on my breath and be more in tune with that and more rhythmic with it, where I think a lot of times, and I always encourage people, my clients, to nasal breathe as opposed to mouth breathing, because it regulates you, because you can only go so fast when you're nasal breathing versus getting into going more anaerobic because you're breathing in and out of your mouth. So it allows me to be more methodical with my breathing, more rhythmic with my breathing, and then I've also been able to tap into my body, into my mechanics and my movement patterns, and how efficiently or inefficiently I'm moving. And all along the way, in a race situation, here's an example. In the Boston Marathon, you're kind of in the zone, you're in that flow, and for whatever reason, I just out of my peripheral, I saw a little girl on the side of the road with her family, and she had Twizzlers in her hands. She was handing them out to the runners, and I just happened to catch a guy run over and grab that Twizzler from that little girl, and that girl she jumped up and turned around. She was smiling, and she was looking for her parents because she was so excited. And, I mean, now I have this girl is never going to forget that experience. That may lead to her wanting to run the Boston Marathon at some point in time, but she's always going to have this experience from the Boston Marathon. So in that flow state, that kind of snapped me out of it, but then I had this unbelievable great appreciation for what I was doing and the gratitude for what I was doing. And then I just had like this big shit-eating grin on my face for probably the next 23 miles because of this little thing that I saw.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a good story. Yeah, it's interesting when I was looking at some of Dr. Passey's research as well, and something I put on my slide, anywhere between like 5 and I think it was 20 micrograms of LSD also increased adrenaline. So I'm thinking even in that sense with like performance, like what happens when we do get these boosts of adrenaline with a substance? Does that help us like, maybe run a little bit faster or more distance? Does that help in any way? Could be, right? Absolutely.
Well, here's an adrenaline piece to that Boston Marathon experience. They just finished the national anthem, and as they finished the national anthem, 2 F-15 fighter jets like buzzed overhead.
Wow.
Yeah. And so just the roar of the engines, and it was an overcast day, so my head shot up to see what it was, and as soon as they flew overhead, they disappeared into the clouds, and like that adrenaline was just, it was like, here we go, let's do this.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a really interesting topic, and I think one of the difficult parts of science is like not always taking subjective experiences into the matter. Because some people are reporting a lot of benefits with a lot of these, different protocols and whatnot. And then, is that really valid? Could be, could not, right? And then I also realized we didn't touch on the other question that you asked about even macrodosing, right? And so it seems like the microdosing or small mini doses are more associated with like, these creative states, flow states, maybe paired up with exercise. Maybe it's like a regimen to try to balance your mental health. And then on the macro side, like a macro dose would be, I guess, more in that therapeutic space of really kind of going into the unconscious and doing a lot of depth-oriented work. And, what type of effect can that have long-term, right? So, what if you're in more of a therapeutic setting? Like, say, we'll use what MAPS is doing with MDMA for PTSD. MDMA, some people might know that as ecstasy. Ecstasy might contain MDMA, but might contain a lot of other things. So MDMA is the main ingredient in that. And what's interesting about that compound, some people say it's not a psychedelic, it's more of an empathogen, produces more empathy and feelings of love, and it's a little bit different on the like neuroscience side of things. Binding to different receptors and whatnot. But, what's interesting about that is that, thinking about PTSD, right? Maybe microdosing could help with that. But with this, it's like with traditional talk therapy, people that have trauma necessarily can't talk about or process their trauma without getting re-triggered. And so the limbic system, specifically the amygdala, is like the fire alarm. And so when people start talking about it, it's like fear. And, their body goes into a response, either like fight or flight. And it's like, I got to get out of here. Or I need to like shut down or freeze. So what's interesting about like MDMA at a certain dose is that it helps decrease like blood flow to that part of the brain, and allows people to process their emotions and their experience without being activated with all this fear. And so what happens when we can actually go deeper into the unconscious and process, say, traumatic memories or things that might have happened to us, and what type of healing can actually occur in these states. And I think that's where I find the most interest in these substances, is kind of like that prolonged healing effect that can happen from processing deep trauma or experiences in our body, because I think a lot of us don't realize that we carry a lot of this stuff around, even if we're not aware of it. And, a lot of interesting research is coming out about like epigenetics and how, say, what happened to, your parents and grandparents is still influencing your behavior. But what happens if we were able to reach a state of consciousness where we're able to kind of process these experiences that our body is holding on to? What kind of psychosomatic healing can we do, and what happens when a lot of this stuff becomes resolved? And I think that's the difference between like doing microdosing, where, it could be kind of like this performance enhancement thing, or kind of like an enhancement for mental health. But then on the macro level, it's like digging a lot deeper and going deep into the unconscious or the psyche, and actually trying to process a lot of this stuff that we've pushed away. So.
You had mentioned MDMA studies, and we spoke on mushrooms and LSD. Do you think certain psychedelics have certain properties to help with certain mental or emotional issues, or it's kind of based on the person?
Yeah, again, I think we're at the early stages of really trying to figure that out. Joe, the other co-founder of Psychedelics Today, he always brings up this analogy of, or metaphor of, you don't clean a house with just a Swiffer, right? Like, you need different tools to hit different areas. And, I think that's true, right? So MDMA, seems to work really well for PTSD, just because that deactivation of the amygdala, so you can do processing. But, some people do have kind of mystical-like experiences with MDMA, but it's not, say, a traditional psychedelic in the sense of LSD or magic mushrooms, where, some of these experiences can be very profound, mystical, metaphysical in a sense. And, like, what does that do? So, like, if you look at some of the research with psilocybin at Johns Hopkins, NYU, UCLA, they've been focusing on the spiritual experience or the mystical experience having an effect on near-death anxiety for people with terminal illness. And so, if you could produce a mystical or spiritual-like experience, how does that also change your relationship to death? Would MDMA work for that? Probably. Might be a little taxing on the body for somebody that might be like terminally ill, whereas like psilocybin and LSD, a little less taxing on the body. So yeah, I think we're kind of at the early stages of really trying to figure out where these substances fit in and how they're best used. But, I think it's up to debate, right? Because some of these experiences are somewhat similar, and I don't know. It's an interesting question that we think about pretty often. Like, what substance could be used for what, and like what type of setting is best to work with each specific substance and whatnot. So yeah, it's interesting.
So to kind of add on to that, different medicines having different purposes and what you could possibly use those for. Being on a college campus, we had the honor to have a doctor in here that's working on an opioid study, more in a clinical setting, with not using psychedelics, obviously, not speaking on psychedelics. Just speak on, different people you've talked to, the benefits of, using psychedelics for opioid disorders.
Yeah, the one medicine that's like, I guess, most tied to opiate disorders with psychedelics is a medicine called ibogaine. And ibogaine, I guess, is more this kind of the semi-synthetic alkaloid that's used. It comes from a bush from Africa, the iboga bush, the root of it, and so the alkaloid